So now that we're all set, if you haven't already muted your phone, please do so using *6. And Jan, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you. Actually, before we do that, I'm going to ask everyone who is on the call to answer a poll. We want to know whether you or your executive director, if that's not your role, are you thinking of leaving the organization in less than 3 years, 3 to 5 years, or if you're not sure. And I'm going to give you all a moment or two to answer that, and then we'll check the results. We should have more results than 6. Does anyone else want to answer, or shall we go on and look at the results here? Okay. So it looks like we have 2 organizations online where the departure is pretty imminent, and the rest are not really sure. Jan, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you. Jan Jackson is the Senior Associate at the Annie Casey Foundation, and she's responsible for planning a lot of the technical assistance there. Jan?
Thank you, Debbie, and welcome to everyone on the call. I'm so thankful for Debbie working through the Partnership for America's Children. I know Lee Gibson is also on the call with State Priorities Partnership. The 3 networks have been working over the last 2 years to develop a very, very similar kind of capacity indicator assessment, and all 3 of us have been reflecting on the aggregate results of the capacity of our different networks. And this year we're experimenting with doing a number of joint learning webinars on areas where our 3 networks really need some support. So this webinar on succession planning has been in the works for quite some time, because we're finding consistently, certainly across Kids Count, and I think now also with the partnership and SPP, that succession planning is one of the competencies that really needs support. And there's lots of reasons why, as busy executive directors, one never gets around to sort of even saying the words for fear that, panic will ensue. There's many reasons why boards of directors don't want to tackle it, because it really requires a kind of a process, a depth of ownership, and a series of competencies not everyone feels equipped to do. So we've planned a series of succession planning. I know SPP did one 2 weeks ago, and we've got a third at the end of June to cover the full gamut of competencies and skills and processes that we are really encouraging people to embark upon. So here is some findings from the Kids Count Capacity Indicator aggregate report, showing exactly why so much is at stake for doing this well. We have found that when organizations undergo an executive director transition, their overall capacity indicator scores tend to really take a dip. The specific areas where we find new executive directors need the most support include strategic leadership, decision-making, organizational development, and the pursuit of equity. We know that a lot of our organizations are undergoing executive director transitions, both because we have an aging, so many folks have been there for a long time, including some founders. That's one reason. Second, new executive directors don't necessarily stay for 10 or 20 years. And there's also just an incredible amount of burnout, given what all of you are up against, both at your state and your state political environments, but now in addition with the onslaught of federal challenges. So in terms of one more piece of data, this just came from the most recent Kids Count aggregate report. 62% of the organizations reported being below a 2.5 on this competency. We're trying to get everybody a 3.0 or higher, and so that's why we're really zeroing in. I'd now like to turn it over to Rachel Gibson, who is our technical assistance provider with an organization called RAFA. Some of you may have used RAFA for executive searches, and we want her to kick off, what are the beginning core competencies that need to be part of an organization that is able to make it through these transitions. So Rachel?
Hi, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you, Jan. So it's interesting because I think what you're seeing in your network, we're seeing with our client pool as well. So very timely. So I'm Rachel Gibson. Some of you on the line may be familiar with Rafa's work. I would say Rafa we're a professional services firm. We do everything from outsourced IT, finance, you name it. Sorry. Our section of the work focuses more on change management, leadership transition, and succession planning. And so I would love to pause here, Debbie, if it's okay, to just ask a quick question. Is that okay, just to warm us up?
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay. For those of you on the call, and I know two of you mentioned not being sure when you were leaving or not having a sense of what your departure timeline is, what I'd love to hear from both of you are whether or not you have done anything around succession planning, or whether or not you've heard you're still somewhat in limbo in terms of how best to plan without having an imminent departure timeline. And I know there were two people, so you're not sure when you're leaving, but you're not exactly sure whether you need to be planning for succession or even how best to plan for succession.
So you can unmute your phones if you want to answer orally using *7, or you can just type it in the chat box to everyone.
And if you're brave, you can speak orally. I mean, we want this to be as interactive as possible.
So repeat the question.
If you aren't yet sure about your departure timeline, if this whole concept of succession planning is just garble for you, like, should I even plan for this? What does this even look like? I don't think I plan to leave anytime soon. How do I even? So if it's still pretty much very ambiguous and confusing if you don't have a succession timeline or a departure date.
And so you want to know the reason why we don't have one?
No, are you unsure or unclear about what to do when you don't have a departure timeline in store?
It's more that I'm not sure of the departure timeline, not the
okay.
Not the first reason.
Okay, perfect. Anybody else?
Rachel, Brandy put an answer in the chat box.
Okay, so Brandy said that our succession has not started, our organization has not started any succession planning. So, and I asked that question because sometimes when you don't have a departure timeline, we will hear clients who will say, I know at some point I need to leave, but how do I even figure out that date? And how do I get clarity on that? And that in of itself is a very important part of succession planning. And then there are others who may say, well, the date issue is not the issue. For me, it's trying to think through what are the essential things that I need to be putting in place from a risk management or leader continuity process. And so what we're going to be talking about for at least for 10 minutes as I give you an overarching framework to succession planning, specifically relate to what are some of the risk management pieces that you need to be doing, how do you prepare your organization, and what is the board's involvement, or even where does the board come in these conversations around succession planning. So that's how the conversation will be framed. Tell you a little bit about Rafa and our work. Okay, I'm trying to switch slides, sorry. So, as I mentioned, Rafa, professional services firm covering everything from outsourced HR, IT, search, and transition management. And our search work, we've been doing this work for well over around 15 years. And I would say a lot of kind of lessons learned, particularly as it relates to founder and long-tenured transitions. And I'll speak to some nuances for those of you on the phone who may be founders or long-tenured executives. So why plan for succession? And this is something that a lot of executive directors, CEOs understand the answer to this, and trying to think through how best to communicate it is a challenge. We hear the term succession sometimes, and people go crazy, and people start to think that what you're saying is that you're leaving next year, and that's not really what it is about. The important thing is that it is about ensuring that your organization is sustainable. It really increases your transition success. So we have worked with organizations that may have spent 3 years preparing for transition and succession planning, and they have a greater likelihood of having a successful transition when that preparation has been taken care of. And the longer you have been with your organization, the more time it takes to prepare for transition. And then the other piece is that it mitigates risk, right? So we don't ever have to sell the need to buy directors and officers insurance or any other liability insurance, but yet in the nonprofit sector, we're oftentimes trying to really explain to people why succession planning is important and why boards and staff members should invest in it. And so for those of you who have boards who are a little bit concerned about, and if you bring up the term succession planning and they get worried, I think the best way to kind of frame it is to say this is a risk management approach, that we want to be sure that we have our ducks in a row in the event of a planned or unplanned transition. So the reality is that the simple fact is that transition is inevitable. All of you at some point will leave your organization. It could be retirement, it could be aging parents, relocation, whatever the situation is. And so the point is that we really plan for what we know is inevitable. So there are oftentimes 3 approaches, and I think the important thing here, we'll speak to all 3 of these. No one approach is better. In fact, solid succession planning is a combination of all 3 approaches and things that need to happen across all 3 of these. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And so for departure defined, it's what do you need to do if you have a sense of when you may leave your organization? So you may know that you probably want to retire, for instance, in 2 years, or you have young children and want to leave by the time they're in middle school. Well, what do you need to do to make that happen? Succession essentials, or what are the things you need to have in place regardless of your departure timeline? And then leader development is around ensuring that you have a leader development culture that really ensures internal leader succession at various levels in your organization. So we'll speak to all 3 of those briefly, and our other panelists will talk about how they've implemented some of these things. So this slide is a little bit off, but just imagine our 3 lovely circles around business model, resources, and culture pushed to the center of the culture slide. That should actually be one Venn diagram. But that whole question around where do we even start is the first question that we ask. And so when you think about succession planning, most boards, most staff in your organization go straight to that place of, oh, how do we replace our leader? Too big a shoes to fill. And it's this typical, I think, hero leader mentality that we have in our sector. And what we say is you need to take a step back, and the place you really start is to look at your organization and to really assess your organization through 4 core competencies, or look at it through a lens, a 4-dimensional lens. So your business model and strategy, where are you going? What are your tactics to get you there? Your resources, so both your in-kind and financial, your leadership, which is both board and staff, and of course your culture. And the reality is that, you all know this, that all those things are connected, and that your culture is connected to all of that. And so the place you would start, particularly if you have a departure date in mind, is to really ensure that everybody's on the same page. And when I say everybody, I mean staff, leadership, and board are on the same page around the key strategic priorities related to these core areas. So I'll give you an example. Culture, for instance, it is if you all are either long-tenured founding executives or maybe even the transformational leader, right? Really looking at your culture and saying, okay, what aspect of this culture, because you probably have defined your culture. What aspect of that culture, how much of it is impacting the way resources come into our organization? How much of the resources come in because of me, right? What is the impact of my leadership style on how people strategize? So those are the things that you're looking at that may not particularly be a part of your strategic planning processes, but are absolutely critical as you think about engaging in a transition planning process or even thinking about succession planning. And so thinking back at that departure defined piece, if you have a sense of when you're leaving, the question you're asking yourself is, what is the best and most valuable use of my time in my final X number of years, right? And what are some capacity building plans that I need to put into play? Does my board have a succession policy that clearly defines how we will even manage a transition? Are there backup plans for my key staff? And so that's what you're looking at, because you cannot do everything in the final year or two in your tenure, and so you're using that time to really prioritize. So I'm going to pause there and see if we have just maybe one question.
So remember, you can use that chat function at the bottom of the screen on the left, and you can target your question to all co-presenters, and that way if other people want to add to Rachel's answer later, we can do that.
Thanks. Okay. So let's look. So the second approach, we talked about succession essentials. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. I just heard a click in my phone, so I hope I'm still okay. So in terms of the essential documents that you need to have, so if there's anything else you do, and if you get nothing else out of what I say, hopefully at least there is this kind of understanding by the end of this webinar about what are the kind of two key tools, processes that I need to engage in around succession planning. The first is the emergency backup plans, and then the second is a board-adopted succession policy. So we'll speak briefly about what these two things are. So an emergency backup plan is really looking at what are your key duties and your key relationships. So for those of you on the call as executive directors, I would imagine that your job description probably may not have been updated recently, and if you do have one, it doesn't even come close to defining exactly what you do. And so the first step is to really start to document what are your key duties and key relationships, and who are one or two backups in your organization that could carry out those functions in the event of an unplanned departure. So in the event that you may have to leave your organization for 2 months because something happened, right? What are the cross-training needs for those people who are backups? What do they need to be trained on in order to back you up? And how do you notify people that they are your backups? For the succession policy, this is a board-adopted policy. So I hear very often that I have a succession policy, but my board has never seen it. Well, that's not a succession policy. That is a document that an executive director created. A succession policy is really a board-adopted policy where the executive committee or the governance committee sits and talks about what do we do in the event of a planned departure, and how do we use an acting director? Do we use an interim? How do we put together a transition committee, a search firm? It kind of spells out some key things that need to happen prior to or when an executive gives notice, I guess, or an executive decides that they want to step into a different role in the organization or outside of the organization. Now, we have a template for a succession policy, and that is something that we can certainly share after the webinar so that you all at least will have a specific tool to help to guide those conversations. And then the other piece, sorry I'm going too fast, is, and the final piece, the final approach is around leader development and ensuring, what I will say is it is very heartbreaking when there is an executive search that is being undertaken in an organization, and internal candidates who have been with the organization for a number of years, sometimes decades, are not competitive with external candidates. And we're not saying that internal candidates should be shoo-in for the job, but at the very least they should be competitive. And so thinking about leader development as a key component of succession planning is important. And so thinking about what kinds of stretch assignments, coaching and mentoring opportunities, and training do I need to give to really solid leaders within my organization? How do I align these practices with my HR practices? How do I measure those leader development processes? And how do I communicate them throughout my organization? And so looking at leader development not as a after-the-fact strategy, but as something that is core to how you develop people and how you do your work. So I would say, as kind of like a summary, the three approaches, leader development in addition to departure define and succession essentials, gives you a good start in thinking about how best to approach this. So that's the high-level framework, and I'm going to turn it over to Patrick, I think, who will kind of speak to his experiences.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Jan, for teeing up this very important topic. I am Patrick Getline. I am the Communications Director and COO of the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis in Richmond, Virginia. Nope, go back one slide. Thank you. There was supposed to be a slide in there before that one, so pretend you didn't see that slide, everybody. So I'm the Communications Director and COO of the Commonwealth Institute, but what you need to know right now is that today I am 6 days into my role as Acting President and CEO because our real President and CEO is out on sabbatical. A much-deserved sabbatical, I might add. He is our founding ED, after all, and he's been at this for the last 10 years. And frankly, he needed a little bit of a break. He'll be gone through September, and while he's away, he's left me in charge with 3 new staff, 2 hired without his input, one of whom is doing my job while I do his, and additional internal shifts and responsibility that make all of this possible. Now, we learned of this grant-funded sabbatical opportunity last year, and we didn't think we were going to get it. But as luck would have it, we did. And long about September, we began planning in earnest for how to pull this off. Now, I have to say that so far, everything is going really well. Everyone's getting paid. I'm ready for my first board meeting next week. We've produced and issued blog posts, and we're working on several additional analytical reports. And while we put in a lot of work in the last several months to get ready for this moment, the truth is that we started laying the foundation for this transition in the work we started doing about 4 years ago around the idea of succession planning. Only we didn't call it that. In 2013, we began a strategic planning process to better focus our approach to our work and our organizational development. We started working with a really terrific consultant, Isabel Moses, and she helped us make some early strides in better organizational practices and procedures with respect to basic management and delegation. For example, we adopted a management structure featuring a 4-person leadership team of policy, communications, and development who reported directly to Michael, but who in turn managed their own respective teams. And that was all good. But as part of our strategic development, Michael wanted to make sure we addressed larger issues around succession planning, things like deep knowledge around organizational practices, our business structure, budgeting, our funders, and board development, things like that. Now, to some people, succession planning can sound like a very rational, reasonable, logical thing to discuss as an organization grows in size, grows in capacity, and as it ages, and as the people who lead it and work there move up and move through professional life. But to other people, staff and boards for example, talking about succession planning can set off alarm bells, and it can feel more like, oh crap, the ED is leaving, she's burned out, and she's our founding ED. What are we going to do? And that kind of high anxiety response can really get in the way and detract from a productive conversation. And in our case, Michael was perfectly fine. He wasn't burned out at all. He was genuinely happy in his position, and he still is, particularly now that he's on sabbatical. But the work TCI was very much a dream job for him in so many ways. As the founding ED, he drew great satisfaction from the work and success of the organization that he helped build. But at the same time, he was really wrestling with some bigger issues, the kinds of things we all face at some point. That same year, 2 good friends of his died unexpectedly, each from totally different causes, both of them around his age and both with young kids like his. I remember talking about this with him at the time, and the reality of how fast the years go and how, well, you just never know. And that had started to really weigh on him. I'm in the same boat as him, and the two of us realized that this organization needs to start thinking about that. And on top of that, TCI had grown in recent years. We were no longer the small, scrappy startup of just 1 or 2 or 3 people like we were in the early years after he launched the organization back in 2006. We now had 10 staff, and fortunately, several of the early staff members were still here and possessed substantial corporate knowledge. So we figured that this was the right time to start the conversation. The fact is, we had to grow up and envision a future for TCI beyond just the next year or 2 and beyond just those of us gathered around the table. So Michael shared all this with our consultant, and she offered a brilliant insight. We won't call it succession planning, she said. We'll call it ownership planning. And with that small change, we could avoid the succession planning triggers and could instead focus our conversations around how each team member strengthens their ownership of their issue portfolios, ownership of their roles and responsibilities, and really go deeper into the organization. By doing that effectively, we would be able to work through many of the very same issues related to transition planning, but in a non-threatening, non-anxiety producing way. And it was particularly critical in our case because so much of the organization's history, structure, and processes were stuck in Michael's head, and we needed a structured way to pull them out. And it's worked out pretty well. What's been most interesting is, more than anything, the transition to the concept of ownership has helped lay the foundation for our organization's broader culture of performance, accountability, and individual and shared responsibility ever since. The set of conversations we had and we continue to have as part of the process from that point forward, in staff meetings, in half-day retreats, in multi-day offsites, they're all fruitful and productive, and they've helped us to make important strides as an organization in advancing our goal of developing a real organizational culture of ownership, defining what it means to own something, clarifying what the thing that is owned is, where every team member understands their roles well, what they own, what they contribute to, and how they contribute, and then how each contributes effectively across all aspects of the organization. Working through the dimensions of ownership planning has also allowed Michael to move away from the day-to-day clutter that was no longer the highest use of his time, and that he no longer needed to be doing as other staff also grew and developed. We all had to learn new roles, to do new things, or in his case, to stop doing things, which can be a lot harder than you think and requires a great deal of trust. For example, in the early stages of this process, the communications director, me, and the research director, both of us longtime staff, took ownership of the final content and narrative of our twice-weekly blog posts. Michael, who had up to that time exercised a very strong hand in the crafting and editing of all blog content, he was taken out of that path. And truth be told, he had become something of a logjam because everything, reports, blog posts, grant proposals, grant reports, staff HR issues, everything funneled to him and through him. So we discussed it. We talked about the implications and the expectations of what owning the blog content would mean for me and for the research director, and we came to an understanding and we took him out. And it was only if either of the other two staff felt that a post needed his review was he brought back in. Now, I don't want to minimize this. This was a really big deal. For the first time in the history of this organization, content was being researched, drafted, and published without ever having been seen by the executive director. That was among the very first tests for us of whether we could really pull this off. Another example is our weekly whiteboard meetings. We start each week with a brief 15 to 30-minute stand-up meeting at a whiteboard where we write up and review the big tasks for the week, and we discuss each person's role in getting them done. Now, Michael had always run those meetings, but after our consultant observed one, she noted that the content of the meeting was all about policy work and project management, really lower-level stuff, and not the higher-level organizational concerns that the ED really needed to be focused on. So Michael was taken out of that path, and ownership of the whiteboard meeting moved to the research director, whose role and responsibilities further developed to include greater ownership of staff management and project management as a result, which also further relieved the ED of those tasks and moved ownership to others within the organization, developing their skills and commitment. This approach has allowed Michael to progress in his own professional development, to focus more on the things that are the highest and best use of his time. Things like strategic aspects involved in our work, growing key relationships with stakeholders, including funders, and launching a long-planned individual giving program and engaging our board more productively. And it's allowed other staff to develop into new roles, to try new things, and to take increasing ownership of the organization. It's also helped us become resilient in the face of staff changes. It's helped us become much better at welcoming new staff into the organization and bringing them on board in ways that set clear expectations for roles and for performance. Over the last 3 to 4 years, we've continued to make strides on these issues, implementing practices we learned with Isabel, like the concept of MOCA project management, which has become part of our formal and informal vocabulary, and an organizational culture that effectively delegates work within and across the organization, that expresses clear, well-defined, and measurable benchmarks of success, and that has clear understanding of roles, responsibilities, and structured accountability. And while we never once talked about succession planning or transition planning, all the work we've done on ownership planning has positioned us to be able to walk as the Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis, no matter what kind of staffing change, leadership transition, or opportunity comes our way. So with that, I'm happy to entertain any questions either on the phone or through the chat feature. Great. Seeing no questions, I will turn the presentation over to Becky. I think that's right.
Hi, this is Becky Wagner. Well, Patrick, that was just about perfect. So now I'm going to tell you down in the dirty part of the ditch how this plays out a little bit. But I did want to say to Rachel, you know, on that why change, why stop, why plan, I really liked the one that said win the lottery, because that just sort of felt, wouldn't that be fun? And then stay right in this work. At any rate, I'm Becky Wagner. I'm the Executive Director here at Advocates for Children and Youth here in Maryland, statewide organization. We're doing our work in Baltimore and around the state. So 2.5 years ago, our organization was writing our strategic plan. And it was at that point that I essentially gave notice for my retirement. It was a 3-year notice. So we were able to write it into our strategic plan. Now, our board members and staff participated in that strategic plan process. So it was a starting point for transparency around just how this was all going to play out. And in a large organization, of course, you expect some transparency, but in a small organization, there are no secrets and there shouldn't be any secrets. This plan called for a transition team of the board to be formed in November 2016. And with some nudging, I made sure that it was on the agenda for that board meeting. The previous meeting in September, I asked the board members to think how they wanted to be involved in the transition, and specifically if they would like to consider serving on the transition task group. That resulted in a selection of 2 longtime board members, 2 midterm board members, 2 first-year board members, and a previous board member who has remained committed to ACY over time. It also reflects 4 men, 3 women, and 1 person of color. The group has had 2 meetings and 1 online meeting. And at that first meeting, I shared particular articles and links to reading about successful transitions, and particularly in my case, a planned succession. They then gathered, and this is all in the guise of not wanting them to have meeting fatigue, they then gathered to think generally about the position. During that meeting, I discussed the scope of the work given our small size, what was working well here at the organization, what could work better, what skills might be needed for this next ED. And since it's fair to say that this is not my first rodeo, I could provide feedback on transitions, having followed an original founder and leaving 11 years later with a perfectly teed up transition plan, which resulted, sadly, in 3 executive director hires within 3 years, and then transitioning into my current position, which was following a PSTD event here at ACY in their leadership. So at our second meeting, the task group responded to drafts of an RFP, the position description, and materials that are current and related to ACY's work. And as a result of that meeting, the documents were blended, the committee edited and okayed them, and we sent the RFP to 4 firms for responses. I had contacted a couple of colleagues and a couple of foundations, asking them who it was they used for their most recent executive searches. So I selected 4, and the RFP was sent out. The proposals, everyone responded. That was just, great news. And the committee agreed to 2 interviews of the firms from the 4 candidates. And once the selections were made, we then approached 2 foundations, and we've asked for financial support for the costs related to the consultants. Now, on a parallel track, since the staff was part of the strategic planning process, they have full knowledge of this march forward to my retirement and their next executive director. There are little things that I think are important. I think last year and this year I reminded staff that a new executive will likely take a look at their evaluations. I encouraged their written sections and their evaluations to be aspirational and demonstrate the what and the how of what they hope to accomplish, why they care about this work. If there were any small or chronic matters that needed to be addressed, I kept them oral. There are rarely any surprises at our evaluations. Things that make me crazy might not bother the next ED at all. I didn't want to color, and I don't want to color that person's opinion of each staff member. So I'm saying essentially to them, keep these small matters off the record. Also, when we interview potential new staff members, I'm sure to let them know that in 6 months, they will have a new executive director. In some cases, that could be great. I mean, maybe they just really don't like me and wouldn't want to come here and work for me. But there's a window there, too. It's also a time where you start sharing information externally with stakeholders, with people that you do a lot of work with. I've stood on a line in Annapolis this past year for weeks. We're working on earned sick leave, and we have a number of people who I've become fast friends with from all corners of the state of Maryland, and it was only in the last week that I said to them, as we were nearing victory, at least in the House and the Senate, that I said, we've got to get this done because I'm not going to be here in January for the next session. And it gave us all a chance to say that we cared about each other, but we care more about this work, and so it gave us a chance to talk about the future. I think that during this last year, in all of my conversations with funders, I've raised the fact that I'm leaving, when I'm leaving, and the board's planned involvement in all of this. Universally, there seems to be a lot of respect for putting this into our strategic plan and for our transparency. And in truth, now that I'm sort of 5 months out, I simply have to start cleaning up my computer. I know no one needs draft 14 of some document that I made. I need to create notes for the status and nuances of funders. I need to create a tip sheet for the members of the legislature that we know and work with. One of the challenges is that I'm a generalist. My staff are our issue area specialists. So the person selected will need to be a combination of nonprofit leader with HR and financial knowledge, fundraiser, legislative strategist, a stakeholder partner with more than 70 coalitions, or have a plan as to how that's all going to get done. So that's where we are right now. Here at ACY. The transition committee now moves forward with their selected firm, which coincidentally is RAFA, and I get to step back and just be available for when there's something that they'd just like to have a little more information on. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. I do think we have a time, Debbie, for questions for all of us, if that's appropriate. Thank you.
This is Remy Spray. I think I'm up next. I am the past president of the board of directors for the Colorado Children's Campaign in Denver, Colorado. Just real quick to recap, the mission of the campaign is we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization. I'm committed since 1985, realizing every chance for every child in Colorado. And I am going to give you a little bit of perspective from the board viewpoint. And fortunately, we have Kelly, our current president on the line. So Kelly, if you want to unmute yourself and feel free to chime in with me, I would love that. So what I'm going to start with is, what prompted our planning for succession was the fact that we had a wonderful, very successful executive director resign. She decided that she wanted to shift away from the children's campaign so she could focus on starting a family. The good news is that we were very fortunate because the organization was very healthy and in wonderful shape and really well regarded in the community, and funding was strong and all that sort of good stuff. So the challenge we had was how do you put a succession plan together for someone that you don't want to leave. She was truly wonderful. And so the way that we approached it was we did have the luxury of hiring a firm to help us, and we used a firm locally that specialized in nonprofit VP and above, so that was really great. And we had a little bit of a history with this partner, which made it helpful too. We didn't have to start from scratch with her understanding what the organization did. In terms of, so then the next step from there was that I put together from the board a search committee, and I appointed 2 people to co-chair that search. And what you want to do when you're doing that is you don't want to look for a board member that's a really strong visionary. You want to look for a board member to lead that is an integrator, an activator, someone that will actually do the work, because it's a lot of work to take on that role, even if you do have the luxury of working with a search firm and a consultant. Just like many of you have already talked about on the phone, we already had in place, every 2 years we do our own strategic planning. We had our true north goals already established. So that was really our framework. We didn't need to do a lot of refinement on that to help inform who and what we were looking for in a leader. We were able to go back to that strategic framework that we'd already established. So it wasn't any, which makes it nice because you're not responding in a kind of a panic mode. But we did take an opportunity to poll the staff and the board to see what refinement we wanted when we were putting together kind of the matrix of the qualifications we were looking for. And one of the pieces that the outgoing ED had pushed us on was equity work, and how important the work of equity from an operational standpoint was to the organization, especially considering one of the strong functions of what we do as an organization was doing a lot of work surrounding opportunity gaps. And so we as an organization wanted to train ourselves internally with regard to what it means to really study equity and make sure that piece was strong through our organization, whether it was hiring practices or how to speak it more comfortably, engage from a community perspective. So we made sure that was at the forefront of our hiring practice, so much so that we actually took a tiny budget and supplemented the hiring process by hiring a woman that really specialized in searching within diverse communities that we might not necessarily have used in the past, and really going deep within different communities, both locally and nationally, to recruit for the job. We wanted to make sure that we were reaching every group out there, and maybe that was perceived previously as non-traditional. And we wanted to make sure that with the job description that we looked at that really carefully through the lens of the equity work we were doing to ensure that we were really looking, getting as a diverse applicant pool as we possibly could. That was very important to us. Because if you talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. Let's see. So at that point, we were able to use the consultant, and we defined for us what those key factors were we were looking for in our next generation leader. We weren't it was tough because if you've been in a situation where you're replacing someone who's so successful, the challenge is how do you go to the next level? How do you find a leader that's going to enhance what you're doing? We didn't want to pivot or change what we were doing, but we really looked at how do we bring in a leader that's going to take us up to the next level. For us, what was important and an experience perspective was fundraising, strong policy work, success in managing a staff. We wanted someone who was really strong with outreach and communication. We wanted someone who was able and capable of and had a proven record of strategic and operational leadership. We wanted someone that knew, in a perfect world, how to manage their board of directors and leverage the most out of them. And luckily for us, we found it. We had a pretty smooth experience, and I will say that I think that's in part to, working with a consultant and then teeing it up from the very beginning with the right search committee within your board. And then another key piece I would say is, we worked really hard to maintain a high level of confidentiality because we did make it available to the staff to apply. And I know someone referenced that earlier in the conversation too, that you want to make that available, and I agree, you totally do. One challenge I will say that you might come up against if you do hire internally is sometimes it's hard for board members to change how they view staff members from the current role they're in to a leadership position, which can be sort of a challenge. And I think that's it. I think I've covered, so then another thing really quick, what would we do differently next time? We just had a good run with it. And we did a 6-month check-in after. I know that was really important with the ED. You want to build in timelines so that you can do whether it's a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day, but make sure there's a ton of transparency so that if they say what's that saying? Take a long time to hire but quick to fire. If you find that it's not working well, you want to be able to put some safety cover in for the board so that if they need to make a change, that they can do it really quickly. And I think that's it. I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Thanks, Remy. Kelly, before we take questions from the audience, do you want to add anything to that?
Oh, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Remy, thanks for those words, and I think it was a smooth process. I'm on the next webinar sharing from a candidate perspective what's helpful or not in the transition. But I thought what really attracted me was, as Remy described, the emphasis on equity that made it seem like an inclusive organization. And that was really helpful to me as a candidate leaving an organization where I had been for a long time to know that it's a great place to jump to. And I thought the search committee and all that was very clear, transparent, just a really smooth process to experience, and perhaps that's the use of a consultant also, knowing that board members are busy people and volunteers, so that really helps.
Great. So I'm going to encourage anyone who has a question for any of our presenters to type it in the chat box. Make sure you target all the presenters so that we can see you're asking the question, even if you do want a particular person to answer it. And while we're waiting to see if people have questions, Jan, would you like to talk about the succession planning part of the Advocacy Learning Lab, or do you want me to cover that?
Sure. I'll jump in first, and then please feel free to add. So just as another gentle reminder that all staff, partners, and board members are welcome to access the Advocacy Learning Lab. Succession planning is one of the 100 competencies. It's located in the Organizational Development section, the orange tab, under Leadership, Evaluation, and Planning, and then it's one of the competencies under there. Within that section, down in the resource area, is a link to a whole series of monographs that Rafa put together on various aspects of succession planning, including how to follow a founder, should you hire an interim, what's the board role, the staff role. So it's located as a resource called Executive Succession Monographs within the Succession Planning Competencies. There's a new sign-in for the Advocacy Learning Lab to make it much easier to sign in and remember your passcode. And as Debbie said at the beginning, if any of you on the call have resources that you've put together, please send them to us because we learn from each other. And if you've got great materials, there's always somebody that can use what you've learned to make their journey a little bit easier.
Thanks. So I don't see any questions here. Do any of our presenters have any last thoughts that you want to share before we end the call?
I have one, if that's okay, for Rachel. So I think the point around internal succession and internal candidates is so important because I would say that is very, very difficult, and many organizations really underestimate the planning that needs to go into internal succession and somewhat think it's easier. So I just want to leave with participants that if that is something that is a part of your organizational values, that we strongly encourage it in our RAFA practice, but also strongly encourage planning related to it.
And I would just add that just because of that reason, that the second part of this joint webinar on succession planning, which is offered later in June, will lift up the stories of Annie McKay in Kansas, who went from being working with an organization, leaving the organization, coming back as the new CEO, and Melanie Breachforth in Alabama, who did the same thing. She was part of Voices for Alabama Children, then she left, then she came back as executive director. And we're hoping to, and also Kelly, to talk about the experience of being a new executive director and what kind of support she found most helpful. So we're wanting to lift up how you follow a founder, how you go from being a peer to being a leader, what it's like being a young and also a young person of color in our advocacy organizations. So we're trying to reach the whole gamut of issues from we have no plan to the plan has been executed, but it really is an ongoing process.
Great. Remy or Patrick or Becky?
No, I think this has been very interesting and very helpful. Thank you all.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our presenters today. I will send out the recording, the PowerPoint, the RFP from Maryland, and any other documents that anyone would like me to share to everyone who joined us today and also those who registered but couldn't join us. And that'll be the end of the webinar today. Thank you all so much. I'm going to end the recording.
Thank you.
Thank you.